What's up, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another party knife advanced mechanics guide. Now, I wasn't entirely sure what to call this video, but to sum it all up, it's basically weapon tips, weapon tiers, and weapon tactics. That's a lie. I mean, not entirely, but you know, add in a super complex explanation of seemingly basic mechanics that, for reasons I'm sure Sigmar himself are not aware, simply don't function according to how any human being with common sense would logically assume. But you know, that just doesn't quite have the same ring to it. Now, initially this was just going to be one video dealing with weapons, but there was simply way too much to talk about, and so I decided to split it up and make it into a two-part series, the first of which, well, is this video, and will exclusively focus on ranged weapons, whereas part 2, you guessed it, will exclusively focus on melee weapons. Now, at the end of the video, I've packed a 5-minute segment with as many beginner tips as I could possibly think of that were related to ranged weapons. But first we're gonna get super deep into some of the game mechanics, and if you make it through that, I got something special for you, an easy to learn, easy to use, super straightforward weapon mechanic, which can basically increase your rate of fire by 33%, and in extreme cases, which we'll get to later in the guide, as much as 250%. And it works for 10 out of 16, not including Drakefire weapons, of all ranged weapons in the game. But just before we get to the too good to be true ranged weapon tip, just to set everything neatly up, allow me to first clarify a related and highly misunderstood mechanic in Vermintide, which is attack speed as it relates to ranged weapons, in other words, rate of fire. Now, let's say we wanted to determine just how effective a given ranged weapon was at dishing out boss damage. Now, for this scenario, you would likely be shooting across a larger span of time, let's say 60 seconds, for which we would need not the rate of fire, but the true fire rate, which at first seems quite easy to determine. Simply take the time between each projectile and add that number with itself for each projectile you hold in a single magazine, add on top of that the reload time, and simply divide that number with your clip size, and you should arrive at a number which would represent the average time between each shot over a larger period of time. Which would be true in the real world, but this is Vermintide, and nothing is ever that simple in Vermintide. But let's take the first baby steps up the ladder of complexity by adding two modifiers to the mix: reload speed and attack speed, both of which should work in seemingly obvious ways. I mean, right? I mean, reload speed has to be the time between taking a shot and the next shot being ready to being fired, whilst attack speed would seemingly have to be related either to the attack animation of the actual shot or a property that influenced reload speed. But regardless, it should seem quite obvious that either of these mechanics simply have to affect your overall rate of fire in order to be what their name suggests they are. So do they? Well, no. But also yes. It depends. What exactly does it depend on? I'm glad you asked, allow me to explain. It depends on what ranged weapon you're using, more specifically what type of ranged weapon. Now, let's start out here with the longbow, but this applies to every bow in the game. Now, we're gonna use the huntsman tell in the thrill of the hunt to increase our reload speed by 20% whenever we do a headshot, which I think we can all agree should logically increase my attack speed by 20%. And yet, if you test this hypothesis, you'll find out that your overall rate of fire seems completely unaffected. And that's because bows, as well as throwing axes, seemingly don't have a reload mechanic, and if they do, it's such a tiny amount of their actual attack that the effect is pretty much negligible, to such an extent that for calculating their rate of fire, they only have an attack mechanic, meaning their overall rate of fire is only determined by your attack speed and nothing else, making reload speed completely obsolete when using any given bow or the throwing axes. Now, this is true regardless of whether we're measuring the fire rate of simply spamming left attack as fast as possible, or whether we're measuring fully charged heavy attacks. Whereas the exact opposite seems to be true for any non-bow single-shot firearm, including crossbows. Now, to the same extent that reload speed was negligible to the fire rate of bows and throwing axes, the exact same is true for attack speed in relation to all other single-shot weapons in the game. Meaning you could drink a speed pot, yet your crossbow would not shoot any faster, because its rate of fire is almost exclusively determined by how quickly you can reload, due to the shot mechanic being effectively instantaneous. Which leaves us with a total of only 5 weapons, again, Drakefire weapons not included, being in a category of their own, which can theoretically benefit from both attack speed and reload speed, only 3 of which really gain any significant value from both. So for the sake of simplicity, we can exclude both the Grudge Raker and the Repeater Pistol. This is because the Grudge Raker really only benefits from attack speed in the small window between the 2 attacks, whilst the Repeater Pistol is primarily used on the Bounty Hunter to do fully charged attacks, and thus really only gaining a small benefit to the overall fire rate of spamming left click, leaving us with only 3 weapons to really obtain any value from both properties. The first being Saltspire's volley crossbow, which for some reason I haven't really figured out, doesn't seem to translate to Kirillion's volley crossbow, which seems to be totally unaffected by attack speed whatsoever, unlike Krupa's repeater handgun, which gains an increased rate of fire to both his Terminator-like charged up minigun attack, as well as his single shot left click attack. And last but not least, we have Saltspire's, you guessed it, brace of pistols. As if that weapon needed yet another reason to be motherfucking broken. Now, last thing before we get to the too good to be true tip, allow me to just summarize and simplify all of that information into something, you know, useful. Basically, we're left with 3 categories. Category 1 consisting of bows as well as throwing axes, which only benefit from attack speed. Category 2 consisting of all single shot firearms as well as crossbows, which only benefit from reload speed. And last but not least, Category 3, which benefit from both reload and attack speed, primarily concerning bracer pistols, repeater handgun and the volley crossbow, all of which benefit from both reload and attack speed. But enough screwing around, I think I owe you a super broken weapon tip. Now, this primarily works for Category 2 weapons. As you can see in the bottom left corner, I've added an input recorder, and this is just me spamming left click. But notice the increase in attack speed as soon as I start pressing R right after doing my attack. This is because you're essentially forcing the reload mechanic at a point in time where the static attack animation of the previous shot still hasn't finished, essentially cutting out part of the reload animation, thus increasing your attack speed significantly. Now, before we get to why, when and where this is most useful, I thought those of you who don't consider themselves keyboard wizards should know that you can replicate this result to nearly the same effect, simply by spamming either R or left click, depending on your preference, which you can use to initiate the sequence and sorta get into the rhythm, but I do recommend eventually opting for the precision inputs of simply left click R in quick succession, as this, once mastered, seems to be slightly more effective, due to the spamming sometimes missing its mark. But it gets even better. Now, thankfully reload speed does not stack with itself. Now, normally stacking multiplicatively is a good thing, because you want your damage to take into account the damage modifiers that you already have, adding up to more total damage. But when we're talking about reducing the time of something, that same effect would be decreasing the size of the pie, so to speak, from which the effect of the next modifier would be calculated, thus decreasing the beneficial effect of that modifier and reducing the overall reload time reduced. Thankfully that's not the case, as reload time stacks additively. Now, those of you who have seen my recent true solo with the Huntsman on the Enchanter's Lair has already seen this in effect, but allow me to show you just how amazing this effect can be at its most extreme. Now, we're gonna take 5 shots per level here, and keep in mind that Thrill of the Hunt provides 20% reload speed, and Hunter's Prowl, aka his ulti, provides 40% reload speed. Now, having spammed the first 5 attacks, we're gonna start using the reload mechanic. Now, as you can see, it definitely shoots faster, but having said that, the overall difference doesn't really feel like that big of a deal. And the effective change in the rate of fire seems approximately equal to that of Thrill of the Hunt. So for the sake of simplicity, let's just assume that it's an exactly 20% modifier to our overall reload speed, which when combined with Thrill of the Hunt, should reduce my reload time by 40%, which is roughly equal to an increase in fire rate of 66%. Which should mean that our attack speed here should be roughly identical to using our ulti without any additional modifiers, as it reduces your reload speed by 40%. Now, if you've made it this far, trust me, hang in just a little bit longer. There's about to be a huge "Ah, I see what you did there" moment, at which point you think you got it, but it's gonna be another 3 seconds of thinking before your brain goes, wait, what? No fucking way that's true, cause we're about to turn a 20% reduction to our reload time into a 250% increase to our rate of fire. Now we're talking. No. This cannot be done, but I guarantee you it totally can.
No, you fucking can't.
But it's happening on your screen, right now. But, I don't get it. How is 20% 250%? This don't make no sense to me, man. Well, don't you worry. Allow me to explain. It's all because of this little thing called math. The end. Just kidding, here's an explanation. And just in case you really only care about how it works and absolutely don't give two fucks about why, I've added this nice soothing background. Now, because reload speed stacks additively and not multiplicatively as we talked about earlier, the value of each modifier increases exponentially the closer you get to 100%. And the reason for this is really quite simple when you think about it logically. If you remove 60% of the reload animation, which is what you're supposed to be able to do, suddenly a 20% modifier makes up half, 50% of the remaining 40%, effectively cutting your reload time in half, even though it's only a 20% modifier. Which is why this mechanic definitely shines the brightest on heroes like the Huntsman, the Ranger Veteran, or the Bounty Hunter, allowing you to have multiple reductions to your reload time, which can be used to devastating effect in combination with things like a Strength Pot and a Ranger Veteran ulti to really obtain serious value from those extra shots. Or just enjoy the decreased reload time as you scramble to get your second shot on the assassin after your first shot missed. Now with that said, Ranged Weapon Beginner Tip Montage! Now, if you're a new player, chances are you're starting out as the elf. Now, first thing, when you're picking a ranged weapon for the elf, don't start with the swift bow, start with the longbow. Trust me, you'll thank me later. Moving on, Kruber. Longbow is the way to go, but it's only equipable on the huntsman. For the mercenary or the foot knight, I'd strongly suggest starting out with the repeater handgun. Don't fall into the trap of using the charged attack. Instead, what you want to do is you want to double tap elites for maximum efficiency. If, however, you find yourself half the height and twice as hairy, the most all-around and easy-to-grip weapon is definitely the single-shot crossbow. Do keep in mind that it has a 10% crit chance on zoomed attacks. If that's not your style, the Drakefire pistols are a lot of fun, but I do warn you that they're not super viable on higher difficulties. Now, for the two final heroes, there's really no question about which weapon you should go for as a new player. Should you find yourself in salty circumstances, definitely go for the Bracer pistols. They're easy to use, super versatile, and really forgiving. Not to mention super broken and insanely fun. Fun is the exact opposite of what you're gonna have if your friends have convinced you to start out playing Sienna. But assuming it's too late, get the beam staff. Master its 3 attacks and your entire party will envy you in no time. Now, as a beginner, definitely get Thermal Equalizer as the orange property on the weapon, and keep in mind that the left attack here has several different useful properties. For starters, you basically have a laser scope on your rifle. Now, as you're holding down the left mouse button, simply click the right mouse button without releasing the left one in order to initiate a super high damage single target burst attack. And whatever you do, don't be afraid to hold down R. Now, what this does is basically exchange your life for your overcharge bar, and this is definitely worth it, assuming you're not extremely low of course, and try to limit your use of the right mouse button charged attack. Enhanced Power is the only level 15 talent which affects your range damage. Getting a critical hit body shot deals the same amount of damage as a regular headshot. But if you really want to make a hole in a head, critical headshots, it's the way to go. They deal even more damage and usually trigger whenever you totally don't need them at all whatsoever, and never trigger whenever you totally need them. You're welcome. Kruber's and Bardian's shotgun weapon both have a bash attack on the right mouse button, which can be used to push away trash minions, allowing you to reload, but it can also trigger whichever property you have on your ranged weapon, which has such uses as obtaining ammunition from pushing. If for whatever reason you totally decided to ignore my previous advice and went for the swift bow anyways just because it feels so amazing when you're a new player, definitely make sure to get the talent serrated shots, and don't make the mistake of spamming the light attacks. Even here, the charged attacks are simply way better in almost all scenarios. And yes, I know, it's a lot of fun to be an arrow machine gun. The problem is, it's just not very useful. Not saying it's impossible, but definitely lacking compared to the longbow on higher difficulties. But hey, we're also here to have fun. Just make sure you can look yourself in the mirror once you realize that you've cut down half the entire forest you were trying to protect in the first 3 days of playing Carillion, simply because you needed more arrows. Anyways, where was I? Oh yeah, charged attacks. Charged attacks are amazing, and this is especially true for bows. It pretty much doesn't matter what bow it is. The charged attack is simply better than the light attack, because anything that you would possibly want to do with the light attack that the light attack is capable of doing, you could have just swapped your melee weapon in order to do, but you just didn't because you preferred just shooting with a bow. Perhaps with the one exception of a single shot panic attack into an assassin that would have otherwise hit your face. But even then, now you still have to kill the assassin. If you just charge the attack in the first place, it would already be dead. Now, Bracer pistols. As I told you earlier, these pistols are fucking amazing. They're pretty much the most broken ranged weapon in the entire game. Why? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. But lesson 1, don't use the rapid fire. It's horrible. Why is that? Well, because the accuracy goes down significantly and you're more likely than not just gonna find yourself in a situation where you have absolutely no ammunition because you chose to rapid fire an entire clip into that patrol that you just aggroed, but what really happened was you only hit 2 or 3 shots, but you couldn't see that because of all the smoke coming from the pistols, but you didn't know that, and now you have no ammunition and that strangler's coming right for you, and 3, 2, 1, you're fucked. Instead, super pro tip, only for pros, do a double tap. Much better. Select a target, shoot, shoot. Select a target, shoot, shoot. 2 well-placed shots is enough to kill most elites as well as pretty much any special, assuming you're not on extremely high difficulties. As a good rule of thumb, any high damage single target ranged weapon, like in this case the handgun, is usually gonna benefit most from conservative shooter, since you can pretty much one-shot anything assuming you hit it in the head, so you don't really need the damage, and that's what you're always gonna be aiming for, so it makes sense to replenish your ammunition with a super accurate weapon as you do headshots. Also, a good habit for these weapons is to always reload your weapon if you can before switching back to your melee weapon, such that your shot is actually already ready for the next elite or special that you need to kill. For the longbow, use conservative shooter, assuming your aim isn't like really horrible, in which case get grounder. Also, at a certain distance from your target, your ranged attacks will start to deal less damage as you move further away. The distance where this damage reduction goes into effect is increased for heroes like Waystalker and the Huntsman, and is referred to under passive abilities as the effective range. When picking your ranged weapon property, if you're a new player, stay away from barrage. If you're using something like a single shot crossbow, combine crit chance with scrounger in order to effectively replenish your ammunition, but most importantly, regardless of what property you get, make sure that you have some way of either sustaining or replenishing your ammunition. This is especially important if you want to have traits like Hunter, which are super aggressive, but don't really work that well if you're constantly out of ammunition. And if it feels like this guide was put together in a slight rush, then I apologize, because that was the case. But although it's not the best structured video I've ever made, hopefully the content was able to make up for that, and I hope you guys found some useful tips or at least learned something new. But anyways, that's it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, I love you guys. Stay awesome. Peace out.